Welcome back to the Patient First podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Bryan Laskin, where, of course, we're looking to increase the influence of today's engaged dentists. And today, very excited, have an amazing guest today, Dr. Jeremy Krell, who is a general dentist as well as experienced investor with a business background. He has raised rounds and generated returns for investors at 10 companies, sold 3, and acquired 2 more as a key operator. Jeremy oversaw strategic provider innovation and development at Oscar Health, a health insurance company that had an IPO in 2021. Also led provider and clinical growth innovations initiatives at Quip, a subscription oral health company, and has since built the Barchester Bay Group, a portfolio consisting of over 35 separate ventures. Now, Jeremy is the managing partner at Revere Partners, which is very cool, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. Jeremy's an angel investor and sits on the boards of several healthcare and dental startups and has an 18-plus year proven track record with startups, multi-million-dollar fundraisers, and acquisitions. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Krell. Great to see you again.
Thank you, Dr. Laskin. Really appreciate it. It's really my honor and pleasure to be here and to talk to you. And of course, you know me and my background, and you yourself have had a very entrepreneurial background. So I think it's a great setting to talk about some of these topics.
We were talking a little bit before we started recording about it. You being a dry finger dentist, which I love. I love that term. So you could kind of talk a little bit about your story and how you went from where. We've had probably relatively similar backgrounds, I think, but my guess is probably a little more dry fingered than me. So I'd love to hear your story and how you came to be managing partner at Revere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to say before I even start that it was all planned out. That would be a lie. We kind of explore the journey as we go day by day, and so I'll sort of take you through it in what I hope is a cohesive and comprehensive way. So yeah, dry finger dentist, a spin on the wet finger dentist of the past. I have been a general dentist for the better part of the last decade. I graduated from Tufts dental school in Boston, but these days really heavily focused on the business side of dentistry. Where I found my both expertise as well as my passion. So I've spent about 18 years in startups. Besides the practices that I'm sort of a silent partner in now. I started with a web and graphic design company. I'm neither a web nor graphic designer, but I had a really good friend who was, and we launched 2 companies out of it. And we did a deal with the Rachel Ray Show with Models, and we sold those 2 companies, and it felt really good. And I said, let's try to do that again. And without maybe as many bruises and scratches along the way. And so we did. I launched or was on the founding early partner team of a luxury good and commodity service targeting college students. Did laundry pickup and delivery, room cleaning, appliance rental, PC backup. Scaled that over 4 years, right around the time and in the place that really the Facebook team was founding and scaling. So you can imagine, right, scaling a business without social media. And we sold it about 4 years later, prior to the 2008 market crash. So just good timing, a stroke of luck, and so decided to start an incubator. I wanted to work with startups on a greater scale. I started it in Boston, scaled it to New York, Chicago, San Francisco, sort of industry agnostic, but we had a lot of healthcare and dental in there too. We would help startups, lean startup methodology, really recruit and retain talent. With very limited resources, we help them find funding. We help them to provide a bunch of services like web and graphic design, pro forma financials, legal, that are otherwise expensive or in some of these kind of niche expertise areas. I ran it for 5 years and ultimately stepped down to sit on the board to accept that role at Oscar Health, heading strategic provider innovation and development. And we IPO'd about 9 months ago. And then I went to Quip, a subscription electric toothbrush oral health product company, and sort of the early dentist behind Quip. Scaled with them the professional side of the business for about 4.5 years, and then ultimately started hearing from so many others, hey, do you sit on boards? Do you invest? And I sort of remembered how I would treat patients and how I like to help people in that way. And I saw, sort of startups as my new challenge. And so I started the Barchester Bay Group with over 35 companies now under management, about 12.5 of my own investments there. And ultimately so many startups saying back to me, it's so difficult to fundraise in this space if we're in oral technology. How do we do that? If we go to the VCs out there, they don't understand oral health and they don't have the data to support doing it or tracking it. If we go to the corporates, they're sort of acquiring businesses that are late stage or they're investing way later in the growth trajectory. If we go to dentists, they invest sometimes as angel investors, but you have to go to hundreds of them, dozens of them to get the type of investment sizes you're looking for. And so how do we do this? How do we scale up innovation in oral health? And looking at the investment landscape, decided it was the right time to start Revere Partners, which is the first and only independent VC fund in oral health. And I'll kind of underscore, again, we invest in oral tech, right? We don't invest in the dental practices, all the technology inside of the four walls. And that's sort of how I landed there.
Yeah, I think it's phenomenal. You and I have talked about, I've invested in some companies and obviously grown and exited some companies too in oral tech. And there's some challenges, I think, in the oral tech space for those, because probably a lot of dentists listening haven't invested in a lot of technology, or else they don't recognize the challenges that an early stage technology company entering dentistry has. Particularly, I think that most VC funds want to go outside of dentistry. You see that with a lot of companies that have started in dentistry, so they start going outside. And I think you and I agree that, particularly for oral tech companies, it doesn't always make sense. And so, having a fund that focuses purely on oral tech, which I think is sorely needed for the profession of dentistry, because it helps keep the focus on dentistry, which I think is vitally important. And then I think you're also allowing sort of dentists to have a pathway into investing in early stage companies to help grow those companies, correct?
Yeah, so you need there are dentistry is like any niche industry has its own sort of rules of the road. Been historically a very self-regulatory industry, and in addition to that, you have to understand and what works and what doesn't work here. It sort of takes one to know one, right? So for example, in dentistry, if you're going to require the provider to go out of their workflow to do your thing, right, to use your widget, your gadget, it's not happening. Right, they're busy and they run a tight ship in the practice, and so requiring them to open up additional tabs, log into other things, pull out your device, it isn't going to work. And if we're being quite frank, yet another sort of rule of innovation in this space is, if there isn't somebody to pay for the thing you want to do, the product or the service, it's also not happening, right? There's a lot of sort of great ideas and almost fantasies out there, but you have to get down to brass tacks, right? If ultimately speaking, the insurer isn't going to pay and the patient's not going to tolerate an increase, well, you're not going to expect the provider to eat it, right? Because it's a chance at better care. That's just not enough, right? And so I think you have to really understand the space deeply. Who is the go-to-market, right? I think a lot of startups, I hear them commonly saying, "Oh, my go-to-market is Shiner Patterson." That is not a go-to-market strategy, right? A distributor is a place to find, but it's a grocery store. It's a huge one, right? I think Costco, it's got, the startup is on the 189th row in the back of the row at the shoe level, right? It is not in the first row at the eye level, and so, the company has to have a full marketing plan and sales plan to support the growth and sale of its product. It simply cannot rely on, for example, a distributor to sell it. Plus, there's a margin question there, right? So, there are a lot of these, these areas that come up. There's also gaps, right? There's a gap between the provider and the industry, which is enormous. There's a gap between the industry, which is enormous, and the startup, which is small. There's a gap between the startup and the provider and the patient, which have all these demands that often come from what they're exposed to in other verticals that aren't being met in dentistry. So you sort of have these four parties. We always think about it as patient, payer, provider. Well, I'm going to kind of challenge us in this talk to think about it as patient, provider, payer, and startup, right? And there's this diamond structure, not a triangle, and there's spaces between all of them, right? And so we sort of act as a bridge. So, a little bit more about Revere. I think kind of three things we've done well to date are, number one, we built the data, right? We spent a lot of time digging into data. There is no pitch book of oral health. The data is simply not there. And when I say pitch book, I mean the online, platform to find investment information. And so, what we did was we accessed some 600 or so companies, about 1,200 or so transactions. We built an infrastructure around that database. So we really look at this, this industry in a very quantitative, analytical way, and understand the investments that we make and what are appropriate valuations and things like that. We've done our homework, right, effectively. The second thing we did really well is I think we built the team, right? So you'll notice Revere is a really unique team structure. It's 3 tiers: an admin tier, a venture partner tier, an associate tier, about 70 people in total, and they're comprised of dentistry's leaders. Leaders from manufacturing, distribution, insurance, DSOs, leadership from professional associations, academic institutions, labs, retailers, you name it, and quite a few clinicians and scientists. So we can effectively fill a diligence team with all the necessary perspectives that you need to really evaluate a startup. And so I think that's really really helpful, and we feel really humbled to have the folks in the industry that have supported us support us to date. All of those people are associated with helping us to source our investors, source our deals, diligence our deals, support the companies we invest in, and support our operations. There's about 12 portfolio companies total now, about 250 companies in our pipeline. That tells us there's a ton of innovation in this space. We have about 100 or so in active stages of diligence, so lots of excitement. And then the last is really the way we structured the fund. We're an angel list rolling fund, which means to an investor, to an angel investor, a professional type like a dentist, all of our investors have to be accredited. And with AngelList, we've built this really easy to use dashboard for them to track everything. And on top of that, essentially it's a subscription service for their investing, right? So instead of doing angel investing on your own, where you have to source the deals and it's hard to look at all the competitors because you can't see them as easily, and you have to diligence the deals, and that's hard to do because it takes a lot of analytics to do that right. And then to invest in the deal, which involves all kinds of tax implications and legal implications, right? We've effectively structured all of that for you. And so and it's subscription service, so you can remain more liquid over time. Instead of putting in one big chunk investment, you can invest quarterly, right? You get much more diversified that way because we invest in 3 to 5 companies per quarter. We have us as the general partners have better control over supply and demand. So we don't invest in we can wait. We don't invest in bad deals. And ultimately we stay open. So we can always be raising money instead of closing. And we have a lot of exemptions with the SEC too. One of them being around being able to market the fund. And that gives us a lot of latitude. So altogether, we've created this very unique thing in a space in dentistry that didn't really exist, but there's a lot of interest for. And I hope that there's interest in this community as they hear our story more and more and know that it's kind of by doctors for doctors.
I think it's great. And I think touched on a lot of points that for the dentist who hasn't been part of VC funds in the past, you've solved a lot of the problems, I think, to invest in oral technologies. Let me ask you, you've been part of a VC fund, at least outside of dentistry, more broadly. So what brought you back to create a fund specifically for oral tech?
Yeah, I think, look, part of it is my clinical background and knowledge, right, in this space. I obviously feel competent and confident to operate within this space. I think part of it is that there was nobody else doing it. We could not understand why. There is a lot of innovation that goes on in this space. There are a lot of deals that perform. You'll hear our other general partner and CFO, Dave, explain that there are a lot of deals that perform really well financially, but people just don't realize them or how to invest in them. And then I think part of it is how we can help them strategically. We've structured everything from executive leadership to executive recruitment, all specifically in dental, clinical evaluation platforms with KOL networks. We've structured the DSO pilots off the shelf, ready for them. We've structured co-investor partners and industrial designers if they have a physical product that are all geared towards helping people in oral health. I think it was the ability to, kind of draw on my clinical background, draw on my, the fact that there was nothing yet like it, draw on my network to pull together an ability to really help the startups in this space, what we call cross the chasm, right? Or cross this bridge where the really little guy can speak to the really big industry, or speak to this huge number of patients that are out there, or speak to the vast number of providers that are out there with a little bit more credibility to them, right? With some of the backing and the support of people who've done it before, like yourself, who know the ropes a little bit, right? And can help maybe the startup to avoid some of the common pitfalls that otherwise cost them a bunch of time and money, might even cost them the whole deal.
Kudos to you. I know it's something that I've done a bit of, and I know the amount of effort that goes into helping these startups. And I know that you're doing a great job of it, which is not inconsequential. I think it's a lot of effort that goes into creating a fund like you have. And so you haven't just created a fund, but you not only have you created a fund that's helping a lot of startups, but then you're kind of turning it back on and having it be for doctors by doctors. So you're giving opportunities to the industry to actually benefit from that growth. So congrats on all your success and thanks for all you're doing for
No,
the
thank you,
profession.
Dr. Laskin. Let me kind of, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but in the spirit of good conversation here, let me turn the question to you. You scaled your own startup in the oral tech space. You have to fundraise that, right, in some capacity. My question to you: if you could do it all over again, and you saw a Revere out there, would you look for it? Would you choose it? Would you source investors from other spaces, or do it differently?
So I did not fundraise for my personal ventures. I have fundraised for ventures that I've been part of. And I think that's been great. Absolutely. Fundraising for fund that focuses on oral tech, I think is great. I think, I've been luckily successful in my practices and building my businesses without fundraising, which was part of that was a strategic goal that I had. I did. And it's comes down to wiring. For me, I didn't want to have to run anything by a board or, I'm just not wired to answer to anybody. So for me, I'm an outlier from that perspective. But I think the difficult way to do it, I think for the average person who's looking to scale a technology business in dentistry, it's absolutely the way to go. I like banging my head up against walls, and that's probably not the smartest thing for most people. But for me, it was the best way to learn lessons. I'm part of several different startups who have raised money, and I would definitely go to Revere. When for the ones that have a focus in dentistry, absolutely,
Yeah, and
absolutely.
I think a lot of us dentists, and it's difficult to put the pin on it sometimes when we're in the day-to-day of practice. But I think, look, there's 32 teeth. It's, there's only a set number of procedures. It's a great profession. You really do help a lot of people, but some of the work day to day can feel mundane. It can feel even grueling. I think what we live for is when things don't always work out as they're planned, right? When you get that crown that doesn't seat, when you get in there to take out what you think is a cavity and then that burr drops, right? And then you have to really start thinking, right? You turn off cruise control and you actually have to start problem solving, right? And that's really the Revere way, right? That's what we do with startups. And so for all of those dentists that are out there, who are practicing, right? And that is your profession and it's your lifeblood, it's your income, right? It's your whole life, it's your baby. We understand, right? And you may have a great idea and/or you may be interested in investing. And so Revere is there to support those, too, who have other things going on, if you will, but are still interested and supportive. I get into conversations, it's one of my favorite conversations these days to have, is with what dentists are invested in. And they love to tell me that they're invested in their practice, which of course, tracks and makes sense. Then we get into other things. We get into, well, I'm invested in real estate. I own my home. I own another home. I own rentals. They get into the stock market, right? They get into, maybe some of them are, really out there in crypto. When the conversation goes on a few steps, we end up getting into a territory where we realize that A, those investments that they are invested in are pretty risky, and B, they don't necessarily know a whole lot about them, right? Why? Because it takes a profession to know about each of those things, right? And we hire people, we hire our financial advisors and our accountants and others around us to, give us advice on where to invest. And what I, kind of continue to come back to the profession and say is, look, we want to be part of writing our own narrative here, right? I think we've seen when others come from outside of the industry and try to kind of write the narrative, we don't always like the way the story turns out, right? And oral health, even oral tech, is something you actually know a lot about, and so it's an area I encourage you to invest in. It's a space that you can be dangerous in, right? Because you have the years of experience using these things, and you have that professional level of expertise in the space. I suppose when I come to people in their New Year's resolution, I know you might be supporting a lot of people and a lot of things out there. Consider supporting, oral tech a little bit, and consider some of the problems that we have in this industry. Right, Dr. Laskin, you and I were talking before the call about some of these issues around staffing and retention and training that we have, and sort of change management whenever we want to change something in the office, how difficult, how much of an uphill battle that is. We also face other issues in the industry too. And I look at on the patient side, right? For example, clarity of prices, like what do patients pay and how do they know what to pay? How do they afford it? What are the financing options? These are all real questions we face in our practice too, not just the clinical ones. And so I look at practices and say, think about the future vision of a practice. Think about a practice where you don't just own the four walls, but you also own a piece of the equipment and the products and the software that you love to use the most, right? Think of having an open window to be able to communicate critical feedback that you have about those products that you wish would change, right? Think about being able to test the newest stuff first. That's really what that's what this is a conduit for. That's what this really gives the ability to do.
Well, that's great. Again, kudos to you and what you're doing with Revere. How can people find out more information and get involved, either if they have an idea that they're looking for funding for, or if they want to be an investor?
Yeah, absolutely. So really the best place to go is our website, reverepartnersvc.com. You'll see there are various different forms throughout the website that you can fill out if whether you're an investor or you're interested in partnering or you have a startup that is seeking investment. For those that are interested in investing, there's a special discount we've created for the Patient First podcast. So if you message in with Laskin 123, we'll offer you a 15% carried interest instead of our standard 20%. And so we'd love to see folks from this community come out and support our budding oral tech industry.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's really cool what you're doing. Only group doing this, and it's vitally needed on both the startup side and on the investing side. So thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.